Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay. The recording should have started, so will I. Good evening. Now you can tell what sort of course you're teaching. If you say good evening and they say good evening back, they're first years. If they write it down, they're second years. If they ask if it's going to be on the exam, they're probably in third year. So a couple of people always put their hands up there to ask, so I reckon you're probably third years. This is the course we're supposed to be here for. That and a bunch of dad jokes like that one. Okay? Or looking at you lot, maybe I should say granddad jokes, because I'm getting a bit older. Okay. There's a whole bunch of stuff already up on this. Who's had a look? Who's ignored it thinking this is the first day of the course and I don't have to bother? Who's done neither? Who's not prepared to actually respond to anything in the first lecture? Okay. Hopefully you've had a look at everything that's there. A lot of it at the moment is just revision of previous courses, what I expect you to know. Course went from 13 weeks to 12 weeks beginning of last year, and I haven't cut anything out of it. Okay? So we really don't have much time to get you up to speed. I'm hoping people will be a little more self-reliant because you are third years or honours students or master's students, and make sure you have revised the course. Who did regression modelling with me? So a few of them know what I'm like. Who did it with Anton in first semester this year? Who didn't do it at all? There's always a couple of people in that category because they can get a credit for it from a different university. It's a compulsory prerequisite. You should have done regression modelling before you get here. Who did regression modelling, then promptly forgot about the course completely straight after the exam? Yeah, there's at least a couple of honest people. Okay, so look, I do expect you to, by the end of the week, have done some revision. Remind yourself of some of the basic things there. We will do some revision today, but that's the only time I'm going to have to do some revision. Okay, the other thing we have to tick off in the first week is admin. And some people have obviously not read this business about, you can always ask me a question about statistics. In fact, you'll find that when you do ask me about a question about statistics, you often get a phone book back in response. I jump on you and sort of try and teach you something. If you ask me questions about the admin, I usually go, oh my God, can't you work it out for yourself? It's all written down there somewhere. You didn't read it. Okay? So, and typically you'll get an email back from me that sort of says that if you send me an email. Probably a good idea not to send me an email because it just annoys me. So this is Tim and this is Yang Yang, who are the tutors for the course. They're mainly here so you can see what they look like. Tim's volunteered to be the person who you can send any stupid question to and get answered. Though probably the answer is typically, if it's an admin question, it's somewhere up there. It's in the course outline, or it's it's somewhere in the guff I've written up on Wattle. So have a look before you ask, because otherwise you're just wasting somebody's time. And just look at it from my point of view. There's about 180 of you supposedly now. Everything seems to get over-enrolled at the last moment in these courses. There's obviously not over 180 people here, because that's about the capacity of this room. And if you all ask me sort of, some questions I've already answered elsewhere, you're going to waste a lot of my time. If you want to see us, the way I'd like this course to work is I'd like you to go away and do some work. I'm going to hit you with a lot of examples. This course is all about what I do as a statistical consultant. Typically, it's an applied statistics course. I'm looking at a whole lot of examples about what happens when somebody comes into my office with a good research question and a data set. What do I do? I'm going to give you a lot of realistic examples. Well, they're realistic. They've all been pruned down because most of the stuff I deal with as a statistical consultant takes hours sorting through a lot of the guff. So typically we've pruned it down, we've made the data, it's not it doesn't have missing data most of the time, it doesn't have real problems. We've sorted all that bit out for you already. We usually will give you a pretty good idea of what the research question is. Occasionally you have to go dig in, but that's also realistic. Often the hardest thing with any client is to work out exactly what they want to know from the data they've collected. They've got a good idea, but they don't articulate it well. And so you've got to build a rapport with them and work out, what are we really trying to do with the data analysis here? We're trying to do data analysis fit for purpose. Why do we put people doing Masters of Finance through this? Because I suspect a lot of you are going to get jobs in one of the big financial companies where essentially that's going to be your main role, data analyst. Okay, you're going to actually find yourself in the role that I found myself in for most of my working life, and you're going to be doing this sort of stuff. And so I'm going to try and give you a systematic way about going about it that is going to help you out in future. So how do you really get the best out of this course? Well, you do some work, you try all the examples. There are examples everywhere in this course. There's already 4 examples up for the first week in the revision section. They're all examples taken from, well, one of them isn't. There's there's a question 2 in the tutorial is brand new stuff. But question 1 in the tutorial suggests go away and have a look at a couple of the examples I've given you from the regression modelling course, work your way through them, make sure you understand it. Make sure you're up to date for this course before you start. And there's 2 examples I'll show you on Wattle a bit further down. But what we're trying to get you to the point is that you can do some of these things by yourself. Then when you come into troubles, then you can come and listen to me recite about the example in the lecture, or listen to these 2 talk about it in the tute, or you can come and see us in our consultation time and we'll fill in the gaps. The trouble is, if you leave it to the end of the semester and try and fill in all the gaps then, you probably won't be getting a HD in this course. Okay, typically as long as you do a basic bit of work, courses with me are not hard courses to pass. In other words, you do some regular work, you sort of meet me part way, I suspect you'll get through this course. And you'll have learnt along the way, you'll have learnt most of the points I want to try and teach you. If you try and do it by correspondence, I'm sorry, this is an elective course for most of you. If you really are going to try and sort of half do it by just try and rote learning stuff at the last moment, I'll be honest, that's the way I did most of my undergraduate. But if you're going to try and do that, this is probably not the course to do it with. Go and do us both a favour and go and pick some other elective. Okay, so like you said, this Wattle site gets quite full of stuff quite quickly. There's also all bits of my sense of humour there, which I won't run you through because I don't think we've got time at the moment. I have tried to anticipate most of the questions I get asked all the time, and so there's a bit of blurb there about if you're having trouble with your tutorial enrollment, don't ask me, ask the office, because they're the people that are going to have to find a new tute if we have to open up. Okay, I notice the tutes are almost full. We'll probably try and create at least an extra space in each of the tutes. So if you're not in your favourite tute, wait until you get the announcement and you'll probably be able to rush in there and get the 21st place that's available in your favourite tute. If we really are over-enrolled, then I'll probably have to find an extra tutorial time, an extra tutor, and that tutorial time will probably be about 11 o'clock on a Friday. 11 in the evening, not 11 in the morning. Okay, it'll be the one of us left. They've pulled down almost every venue worth teaching in, so there's not much left. Resources are scarce at this university and this semester particularly. Okay. So, you've had a chance to look at the course outlines, read all this guff. That's been up there for about 2 weeks now, most of it. I've even had if you want to just sort of start doing a bit of pre-reading, there's actually the lecture notes for the course. There's additional references. I used to put these books, all the additional references on short loan, and found that nobody borrowed them. Most of them are e-books these days, so, and the ones that aren't e-books, I don't want to put them on short loan because there's some PhD student out there who probably needs those to do their PhD. Okay, you may be able to recall it from them for a short while to have a read. A lot of them are just basically, if you want to go further with this topic, where do you go? They are called additional for good reason. The lecture notes cover the bulk of the course, but really the course actually is in the examples. The examples, the case studies in doing statistical consulting are the core of this course. And there's a good advice on how you should work through those. Like most good advice, I'm sure you've skim-read it and not bothered actually looking at it properly. But the first thing you need to do is to get up to speed with some statistical computing package. It doesn't have to be R. We use R because, hey, it's free, always a plus. It's readily available. You can download it in a lot of situations. It's used for the prerequisite course, and it's good. It's contributed to by statisticians freely all over the globe. And in fact, a lot of my reviewing statistical journals these days, I get sent the data and the R code so I can basically check what they've done. Okay? It is really the way statisticians talk to each other these days. Admittedly, we also, some of the dinosaurs like me, also talk to each other in SAS, SPSS, Excel occasionally, if we have to. And a client will come through the door with any of the above. Okay? But what I do want you to do by the end of this week is to check that you basically are not a complete bunning in R. So, we'll have a look at the timetable in a second, but there's some tutorials tomorrow. So tomorrow we're not going to have a lecture. Instead, we're going to have just these extra support classes. There's one at 2 o'clock and there's one at 3 o'clock. Who's used R before? Who's reasonably confident about using R? Okay, well, put it this way. There's not going to be enough room for all of you tomorrow. So really, if you just need to sort of brush up a few things you've forgotten, do it by yourself. What I've put up there is the stuff we start you off with R at the beginning of regression modelling. Okay, at least get through that and remind yourself about the basics. There's actually about four tutorials worth of work in that tutorial 0. It was originally written by me many years ago as a series of 4 worksheets, done once a week, 4 weeks at the beginning of the regression modelling course. We don't have the luxury to do that anymore, but there's a lot of stuff there. Getting in, what you should be able to do by the end of this week is at least do the stuff that's in the revision section down here. And if you can't, it's time to ask for some extra help. If you are serious about doing this course, it's either compulsory for you, which I don't think it should be. I don't think this is compulsory for anybody. Or it's really going to be the best of the electives you could take. Then you need to get up to speed and reasonably quickly. So there's a bit about what you should revise. There's lecture notes from regression modelling there. That was a 12-week course, so yes, don't expect to be able to read all that in half a day. Here's the data sets from the previous course. Here's the bit of advice about what you should be basically doing with these many examples I'm giving you. The basic advice is just this: go through each example, run it line by line. Make sure you're happy with what I'm doing. Typically, I write about it in the comments. I tell you what I've done. But sometimes it's not going to make much sense. If you do a bit of that, and you come along to these lectures or you come along to the tutes, you typically will have a question, you'll have a gap. And once you've got that gap, we can fill it in. Until you've actually looked at the material, that gap doesn't exist. Okay, so please have a go. So what I'd like you to have a go is that these two we won't get a chance to cover ourselves, but they're just basic examples. There's the brain and body weights from various mammals, which was a simple linear regression example, once you got the scale right. There's a multiple regression example with squid data. also from the previous course. And then there's this one here, which I said is homework. Who's done your homework? Who's had a look? Good. Did you bring the sheet with you? Okay, well you can... There you go, there's a few spare copies. You may have to take one between two. Grab one, take it back, pass it back. If that's in that close together, definitely one between two. Okay, because that at 5 o'clock, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through that example. And I'd like you to actually read the blurb about it beforehand, so at least you've got something sensible to say. It's not going to be all me. It could be all me, but it could be a very quiet lecture. Okay. So, if you can do those examples, and there's an extra example in the tutorial involving the child IQ data. If you can do those, then pretty much you're up to speed. You've remembered enough of regression modelling that we can go on. I am going to reiterate some of the main concepts from regression modelling today, but I'm hoping to finish it by the end of today, i.e. before we start discussing the workshop. Okay? So, confusing. First of all, your chance to ask any admin questions now. Please ask them now and don't try and call me at the end of the thing. I've forgotten my keys today. If you keep me here past 6 o'clock, I'm going to be locked out of my office and I won't be able to get my bike and go home. So I'm nicking off back to my office before 6 o'clock. Okay? It's a 10-minute walk or 5-minute run. And I'm not very good at running with this carrying that thing there. Okay, so if you've got a question, please have the guts to ask it now so I can deal with it for the whole group. Everyone got one that wants one? Okay. I don't know if you two need to stay if you don't want to. So anyway, Tim, look, just while I finish discussing the timetable so that we know where we are this week. Okay, so the one admin question I have been asked about incessantly because it's quite confusing is the timetable. So let's have a look at the timetable. Well, actually I've got a link here, so let's go and have a look. I do seem to try and make this as impenetrable as possible. You've got to keep clicking through. Eventually you get to here. Not interested in accounting courses, like the one we just had to wait for. What we are interested in is 3015, which is the undergraduate version, 4030, and 7030, which is the graduate version. 4030 is the honours version. Ah, bugger. That's what they make me type in the dark. Okay, so here's our wonderful timetable. Here's this lecture here. It's in a reasonable venue. This is actually not a bad venue for discussion. I can see most of you lot. I can hear you. You can hear me. The other regular thing is going to be up here. It's in Barry Drive, which is the teaching venue from hell. So it's also, I understand, the venue that most of you got a clash with if you've got clashes. Who's got a clash with the 2 o'clock, Tuesday 2 o'clock time? Okay. Well, look, I think I'll use that for a lecture, which will be recorded, and I'll try and do my best to make sure the recordings are decent quality. and I'll use this first hour here for the other lecture each week. I need 2 lectures and 1 workshop. And I'll use the 5 o'clock lecture. Who has a clash with 5 o'clock on Mondays? I know you've probably all got better places to be, but, okay, because that's going to be the workshop time. That's the one, if you put a bit of work in, you'll probably get a lot out of, hopefully. I'm going to try and do my best. I'm going to put some real effort into rewriting most of those to make them a little more interesting. This doesn't exist except in week 40. So a couple of people have looked at this and gone, "You beaut, I can go at 2 o'clock, I can go at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday." No, you can't. Sorry. That's only the 2nd of October, because the 1st of October is a public holiday. That's the Monday lecture moved by 1 day on that week. Okay? So, doesn't exist. And these don't exist except in the first week. Week 30 is the first week of second semester. Okay? So this one doesn't exist in the first week, but exists all the other weeks of semester. So on that Tuesday, the 2nd of October, we're going to have 2 lectures and 1 workshop in the same day. I'm probably going to have a beer after that one. Okay, and they're the undergraduate tutorials. Now, there used to be a difference between the materials we used to give the undergraduates and the postgraduates. Typically, these days, I present the whole lot of the material to everybody. I just don't necessarily examine you all on it. There's typically one topic different that I reserve to be the topic I'm going to ask a different question about to the graduate class in the exam. And that's the only real difference between the undergraduate and graduate versions. So if you need to enrol in an undergraduate tutorial as a graduate, by all means do. It won't be much different. And same other way around. If you're an undergraduate and you find yourself in a postgraduate tute, hopefully they'll be nice to you. Okay, so why you want to do the postgraduate tutes, I've got no idea. They're early hours of the morning on Wednesday and Thursday. That's what I mean about finding sort of, times in darkness, because the things just aren't available. We obviously got allocated those pretty late in the piece. Okay, any questions about any of the admin or the timetable? Do people know what they're supposed to be doing this week? You have tutorial, because when we went from 13 weeks to 12 weeks, I had 12 weeks worth of material. What I cut out was all the stuff at the beginning where I did this sort of stuff for an entire lecture and did revision for about two or three lectures rather than just one. Now I'm going to leave that up to you. You need to get yourself up to speed by beginning of next week if you really want to understand this course. And I'll send out the next case study by the end of the week. Have a look at it before next Monday. So this week, all you've got are these 2 hours with me. If you need some help with R, like you need to help loading it up because you haven't got a working copy of it, if you just have a one-off question, then don't come right at the beginning of the support classes. Okay, just come for 5 minutes later on once we've started everybody else off. Okay? If you're really needing help with R, you decide, you have a look at those tutorial 0 material, you decide you need to work through it and you're going to need some help doing it, then by all means you're going to attend both support classes tomorrow, starting from the word go, and we'll give you some help. We'll only start you off because, like I said, there's about 4 weeks worth of work there. So you're probably, 4 tutorials worth of work there. So you'll need to sort of do the rest of it yourself. But revising regression modelling, getting up to speed with R. Ideally, I'd like everybody to have done that by the beginning of week 2, so that I'm not talking to people who are going, I don't understand what he's talking about. Okay, so I want you to do your own revision, show a bit of self-reliance, and do your own revision today. Now, Tim's got those 2 tutorials there, and his consulting time is just after that, in that spot there back in his office. All the details are in the course outline, and they're also over here in the teaching block stuff. Wednesday 5 to 6 up to including, so that's for the teaching weeks. Yang Yang has got that tutorial there and all 4 of those wonderful early morning efforts. We don't like Yang Yang very much, we work him hard. But he's already missed his first consultation session because he was late back from his honeymoon, so he'll give us another consultation session later in the semester to make up for that. But his consultation sessions are going to be before that first lecture on a Monday. In other words, if you didn't understand some of last week's work, Yang Yang on a Monday is probably a good time to go to him. My consultation sessions are going to be after this workshop, there and there. Obviously not tomorrow, because, well, if you want me tomorrow, I'll probably be down helping out with the support class, and I'll be back in my office for an hour. Okay, so typically if you want to see us, plan to do it early in the week, because that's when we're offering times. If you really do need to make an appointment for later in the week, you probably won't get me on a Friday. I have a lot of other commitments, and I've set aside Friday as a day when I'm sort of going to say yes to most of those, and they're already booking out pretty rapidly. Okay, I'm not an active consistent consultant anymore, but I do have a few old clients I just can't say no to because I want to keep the contacts, and so I typically help them out for free. I remind them that it's worth the price they're paying. Okay, and typically they're the people I've got to spend time with on Fridays or over at NSEF with some collaborators. So you won't get me on a Friday, and these 2 aren't paid outside of their consulting hours. Okay, so you probably find they're both pretty easy sorts that will probably help you out if you ask nice enough. Okay, so we're going to let them go because they're looking like sort of bad wall decorations over there. So are you right? Yeah, let's go. Okay. Okay, any questions about any of that? Okay. At the moment, most of the work for the rest of the semester I haven't put up there yet. Okay. So the view we're looking at at Wattle here is the student view. Go back to my normal role. And there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I can see that you can't. So all of this stuff. So what I'm going to do is to put that up progressively as we go along. If it's up there on Wattle, it means I've revised it for this year, and I'm happy if you have a look at it. In fact, I want you to have a look at it. So anything that's up there on Wattle at the moment is basically fair game. For this week, most of the stuff that's up there is stuff that I want you to revise from the first semester course. And yes, there's probably more stuff than you need to. You don't need to revise the entire first semester course, but you do need to sort of, you need to sort of, by the end of the week, sort of think, I'm comfortable with what he's talking about, and I'm not getting lost. If you are getting lost, it's a hint that you need to put some extra work in, and that's really what the consulting hours are about. They're there for you to sort of come and get some extra help if you need it. We would prefer students to, we like to throw students in the deep end and see if they can swim, but we'd like to stop them from drowning. So, if you're having troubles, please come and see us. That's why we carefully have all these consulting times. So, I'm sorry, in third year honours and masters, I expect you to at least be organised about how you approach the material. So have a look at what's there, survey it. If you can't work out what something's doing there, yes, you can flick me a quick note sort of saying, what's the point of this? And you probably will get a fairly large answer back, because typically I don't do anything without some sort of reason.
The entire brick for Russian and that's the brick that required for this course?
I think Anton handed it out in the first semester. If not, it's the brick from the last time I taught the course, which was 2 years ago. So basically, it's got I think Anton may have relied more on the faraway text. Okay, but yeah, look, the guts of a basic regression modelling course are somewhere. If you need to revise them, the brick's as good as any way to start. You know, and I'm happy to work through any of this with you to make sure that you are up to speed. Okay, that's another point I should have made before you, because I had to come over and listen to you carefully. I'm deaf. I don't wear these for decoration. So if you do need to ask, if you do have a question for me, please get my attention first. Don't just launch into it. Once I've come round and I'm lip reading, and I can lip read most things except proper nouns and names, which are like Scrabble, it's a complete mystery to me. I have to see them written down. As long as as long as I'm paying attention, I probably will answer the question you asked as opposed to a completely different question. I have a tendency to sort of, latch on a buzzword and give you my usual spiel on that, because I've been teaching for 30-odd years. Okay, so yes, you need to guard against my bad habits and my bad hearing. Treat me like a grandpa who needs to be handled carefully. Okay, let's get stuck into some work, because otherwise we won't have time to do any. Now, what I'll normally do for this course, first of all, let's have a quick look at my teaching style. Another dad joke coming up, just warning you. This is from The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll. This is the bloke that wrote Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. It's a wonderful poem. I recommend it to you highly. And there's a repeating refrain in here. What I tell you 3 times is true. So typically, in this course, the main points will come up again and again and again. Okay? If I tell you it once, it's part of the course. Tell you it twice, it's important. Tell you it 3 times, it's on the exam. It's called the rule of 3. Okay? So there's a fair bit of repetition, and a lot of the examples we're going to go through will make the same point in a slightly different way. The idea being, hopefully, one of these ways you'll get it. Okay? And now, what I normally do is I stand here, and so I don't go too quickly. I write out the notes and I revise them as I go. Because let's face it, I've been teaching a long time, I can do that. And this stuff is pretty much basics to me. Okay? But I won't get time to do this, but this is basically revision. If you did regression modelling with me, I would have drawn up a diagram like this somewhere in the course. Because it's all about the research process, it's about what we do. Client comes into my office, I'm the statistical consultant, data analyst, project officer, called different things in different places. And they typically come in with a research question, something they want to know, and they often come in with some data they've collected to try and answer that research question. And they think that my role in the process is to analyse that data and answer their research question, or help them to answer their research question. It typically is going to be a 2-way process. In the process, I'm going to have to learn a bit about their situation, the science they're dealing with, about their data. I'm probably going to also have to teach them a bit of statistics in the process so they understand the results I'm talking about. Okay? It's a 2-way process. If I'm lucky, they come in before they've collected their data. And then I can hand out some good advice on how to collect the data properly. I can tell them about designed experiments, about how to design a survey properly. I can tell them all about the guts of the one course that we do teach in this school about data collection rather than data analysis. That's the design of experiments and surveys. That's Stat 3012. I can't remember the graduate numbers off the top of my head. I'm hoping I'm going to teach that course again. I used to teach it. I'm going to teach it again first semester next year in place of regression modelling. But if more often, you'll find as a consultant, they come in with an Excel spreadsheet. An Excel spreadsheet on which they've gone happily freeform. They put little bits of information here, there, and everywhere. And you've got to spend a lot of time sorting out their data and getting it into the form that's fit for analysis as far as the statistician is concerned. Now, why do we use a statistical package? Because that's data that usually forces us to have the data in the right form before analysis. It expects us to have each column of our data should be a variable, each row should be an observation. And therefore each cell is basically some observation for some variable on some case. Okay? I'll show you how to get those stuff organised into that fashion, but we won't have much time on data cleaning and data preparation because really, let's face it, it's the sort of stuff you end up learning on the job. Okay, but what you do have to do is assess their data, and you have to work out what their research question really is. And that means sitting down and talking to them about, what do they want to know? Why did they collect this data? What sort of data have they got? Was it observational data? Was it a designed experiment? How did they do the data collection? Did they do a survey? Did they do an experiment? Did they do sort of a field observation? All of these things will make a difference. And then I have to start drilling down into the data and working out what they've got in the way of variables, and I have to describe those variables. And typically the way you would have done in a first year course in statistics, you would have talked about the level of measurement, nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio. They're all ways of categorising variables. Now if that's a complete mystery to you, we will revise that as we go. As we look at each new variable, we'll have to think about what sort of variable is this and how can we model it as a result. But that's why we worry about the level of measurement, because different levels of measurement you can do different things with. So we need to be able to categorise it, and typically we have other ways of categorising data: categorical, discrete or count, and we also have continuous data. The regression modelling course was pretty much on continuous variables, things measured on a continuum. Okay, and they were all numerical, they were all numbers, they weren't typically sort of ordered categories or anything like that. And so one of the things we are going to do in this course is extend that sort of modelling to variables that aren't nice and neatly continuous. We're going to look at how do you fit categorical variables into these. So what do I do first? Having talked through looked through the data, at least got the metadata, an idea of what this data is supposed to be, and the research question, what do they want to know? I then do some exploratory data analysis. I have a look at the data. I graph it, one of the variables against each other. So I do graphs and I do summaries. In R, there's a whole heap of ways you can do that. We have a course on graphical data analysis, which you get Michael Martin in full flight, which is a sight to behold. And he'll take you through all things you can and can't do in that sort of area. But typically, what we're aiming for here is to propose and fit some sort of statistical model. Some way we can model these data so we can answer questions about it. In regression modelling for linear models in R, you use the LM function to do that. Then you would assess and check the fit of that first model. Typically, you'd look at residual plots. If you just go plot the model in R, it gives you 6 plots you can get by default. I think it only gives you 4 of them to look at, but 2 of them are hidden. You have to ask for them. But you can get lots of plots out of just the plot model by tweaking the options. If the model doesn't fit, i.e. the residual plots are bad, what I mean by bad residual plot we'll get to in a second, you go back and propose a refinement to the model. You then sort of say, having got a model you think that at least meets the basic assumptions, that is one where the assumptions are at least believable or plausible, you then have a look at what's the model telling you. And if you were listening to me or Anton properly, you would probably go first to the analysis of variance table. Mainly because that tells you about each of the terms in the model and whether it's a significant part of the model. And again, you might find that some things in the model are not needed. They were observational. They can be refined out. You can come up with a plausible model that's just as good, but it's smaller. Okay, the principle of parsimony. Or you might find that really, you might think there's other ways I could refine the model, and I might want to try those as well. But you cycle through this until eventually you've got a model you think is not a bad model for answering questions about these data. You remember George Box? All models are wrong, some models are useful. Okay? What you hope you are now in is the class of useful models. Something that can tell you something about the data and about the research question you're trying to answer. And that's when you start interpreting the model, making inferences, and typically when you look at the fine detail of the model in the summary table. Okay, you don't jump straight to the summary table and use that to refine the model. It's probably the wrong way to do things. Okay, and eventually you draw some conclusions. Those conclusions may answer the research question. You may be finished, but you're rarely finished because research is an iterative process. You go through iterations of data collection, reformulating your research questions, partially answering that research question, leads you to another set of data collection, another set of modelling, and eventually you get to the stage where you've advanced the knowledge, but you go through a number of iterations to get there. Okay? So often the conclusions lead you back to new research questions, or at least variations on the old research question. The model may have answered part of the research question, but not all of it. What do I have to do? Can I answer the rest of the research question by a different model on the same data, or do I have to do some more data collection? Okay. In the process, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that we make, and these are don't worry about that. These will be up on Wattle when I'm happy with this year's version. Because I'm using last year's, I probably could have put them up in advance. So, the general assumptions underlying all statistical models, this is basically underlying all statistics really, is that the sample of data is representative of the population of interest. Okay, the research question defines the population of interest. It tells you what you're interested in, what are you asking about in the research question. That's your population of interest, and you're hoping that the sample you've got of data that they've collected is going to be representative of that population. It's always going to be a sample, almost always going to be a sample, because you typically can't afford to census. You can't afford to look at every single item in the population. Most populations are either not finite in the sense that they're infinite, they're very large. I mean, there's a lot of questions you couldn't ask about the entire population of Australia because you just can't afford to do a census more than once every 5 years if you're the Bureau of Statistics. But there's also situations in which you just don't have the resources, and you don't have the capability of being able to enumerate everything in the population. The next assumption we typically make, or we have made up to now in an undergraduate statistics course, or the ones you've done so far, is that all the error is in the response of the unknown variable, the y direction. In other words, there's typically one key variable that's part of the research question that we want to know the answer, we want to know something about. And we're assuming the other variables are in some sense known, at least compared to that y variable. Okay? We know the x's, and we can use the known x's to model the unknown y. Okay? This is an assumption we make, and at times we've tried to relax it in regression modelling. And the third assumption we make is that the model we've chosen is at least an appropriate model. Okay? Often, our first attempt at the model, will get ruled out because it's just not a good enough model for this situation. It couldn't. This model could not answer this research question, or it could. It's not really an appropriate model for these data. because basically some of the assumptions that are in the science, but not necessarily in the statistics, are just not there. Okay, so typically, bit of notation here, we're looking at populations, we're looking at parameters in the population, and regression coefficients are examples of population parameters. We don't know them. We don't know them because we haven't enumerated the entire population. We haven't fitted this model to everybody in the population. We have got sample-based estimates of these. And these sample statistics, if you like, these are sample-based estimates, so that's why the hat's on them, of those things, or the small case also typically denotes an estimate. So I'd like to say this is consistent, but different people in statistics have invented different parts of the discipline, and so notation is not always consistent. I will try and keep it consistent, I'll try and define it as we go along, but the notation typically, if I'm talking about large capital Roman letters, I'm talking about random variables. I'm talking about small letters, I'm talking about the sample observations we do have, the data, that are instances of those random variables. Greek letters typically denote population parameters. The Roman equivalents typically denote the sample statistics, the equivalent sample statistics, and they're typically point estimates. But notice already we've now got our first departure there. The estimated mean is not mx, it's usually x bar. That's thanks to Gauss from memory. And who am I to argue with Gauss? Okay, but typically an estimated proportion is often p, an estimated intercept is b0, an estimated slope is b1. Okay, then we get down to the specific assumptions underlying a regression model, a linear regression model. This should be revision of your first semester course in regression modelling. Here's the general linear model. Notice the general linear model. There's no i's on the end. We're going to put the ISED at the end in this course. But the general linear model is basically a model where you've got a deterministic part that's linear and a stochastic part. We have a mean model, which is a model that basically looks like a line in 2 dimensions, a plane in 3 dimensions, a hyperplane in 4 dimensions. It's a linear model. And it's deterministic. It's basically, if you like, our best guess at what's going on average with y. And then there's some unexplained stuff, some stochastic stuff, for which we form a probability model. And the model we've been looking at so far is that these errors are IID normal 0 sigma squared, which is shorthand for the errors that are independent and identically normally distributed with constant variance. Okay, so these assumptions are all about the errors, but typically we don't ever observe the errors, just like we don't observe all the data. So what we will have is we'll have some estimate of the model, and we'll have, at least for the model, estimated model, and for the sample observations we've got, we'll have observed residuals. And the observed residuals are what we use to basically be our best guess on what we've got in the word. They're a sample of the errors. And we're assuming about these residuals, or these and the underlying errors, the key assumptions are independence. That suggests there should be no systematic pattern in the residuals. We're assuming constant variance. There should be no systematic changes in the variance of the residuals. And third, and least, I can't believe the number of times people tell me that normality is the be-all and end-all here. It's not. Often we can get normality just by the fact we've got a nice large sample size. The central limit theorem rides into play and saves us. Okay? So normality is a pretty strong assumption in a small sample situation, but in a large sample situation we're talking about mean coefficients, and regression parameters are just a form of mean coefficient. The central limit theorem will help. And we will have approximate normality even if the underlying distribution isn't really normal. Okay, but typically we assess all of those. How do we assess those? Well, in simple linear regression, Here's the population, lots and lots of dots. Trouble is we never observed that. Here's the sample, just a sample of dots, and we have the observed residuals. We've estimated the model. We found it by least squares, the line of best fit. We've got some data, and the distance from the data to the line in the vertical direction, because remember, all the errors in the vertical direction, not in the x direction. So that's the residual. Those are the observed residuals. And so we can plot those residuals. Now, we could even do it for multiple regression models. And we can have a look at the residuals at different spaces along the x distribution. And what we're saying is that regardless of where we are on the x distribution, we see the same. And we did a histogram as a sort of a picture, an attempt to look at the distribution of residuals at that particular point. We would see the same nice bell-shaped curve anywhere along the range of the x's. Okay. So here is a big part of the regression modelling course, looking at residual plots. This is a plot of the residuals against the fitted values. That's something we can do for even multiple regression models. Because the fitted values are basically the y-hats, if you like, are just a summary of all the x's taken together, the fixed mean model for those x's. That's in the y-hats, so the fitted values are the y-hats. The residuals are the e's, the little e's, the observed errors. Is that a good residual plot? What's wrong with it? Which assumption is violated? They're not independent. That's the important point here. It's not so much that there's curvature. Yes, okay, that's a way of describing that plot. It's curved. There's an obvious systematic pattern. But that's just one of the patterns you can get that suggests that there's no independence here. There's a dependent structure that's not being modelled. Sorry. That probably sounded brilliant on the tape. The microphone. Okay, so what I would have done if you did regression modelling with me is I probably would have dragged out pole everywhere. Unfortunately, they've cancelled pole everywhere, or they stopped paying the subscription to it. There's supposed to be some sort of replacement, but I haven't worked out how to use it yet because I was on holidays most of the first semester. I was off on long service leave. But what I would have done is probably run you through this thing, got you to sign up to that, and give me your guesses on these plots. That's not the plot we were just looking at, by the way. The plot we were just looking at would definitely be A rather than anything else. Okay? But typically, I want you to get used to assessing these plots these sort of ways. These are the things that can go wrong. Definite pattern, the residual is non-independent, non-constant variance, heteroscedasticity, the residuals are not normally distributed, there's some possible outliers, influential observations, more than one of the above problems, always a good default option if you think there's something wrong but you can't work out what the hell it is. And may even get you half marks in some exam situations in the regression modelling exam. And nothing wrong. The one you're aiming for. That means you've got a good model. You've got a model that satisfies the assumptions. So let's have a look at a couple more before we finish off this lecture rather than go on to the tute. Is that okay? Which assumption is being violated? Constant variance, yes. The variance is increasing as the x values increase. It's a pretty simple fix for that one, isn't there? We'll come back to that. Is this a problem? Probably not much of a problem for most of these. That's, the nice little random scatter of points around the model. Possible outlier. So one of the models seems to be pretty good for most of them. One of them seems to be not playing ball, and it might be extreme enough that it's moved the model towards it. In other words, the entire model has shifted up to join it. It's been influential. So it's a potentially influential outlier, vertical outlier. What's wrong there? Here's where you cop out in the exam situation and go, most of the above. Because you can probably see hints of curvature, decreasing variance, and a possible outlier. It's got the whole lot there. It's got the trifecta. It's a sick residual plot. You wouldn't believe the number of times I've actually seen people, just fit a model and their plot looks something like that. You kind of wonder whether the inference they're doing on it is well-founded or not. Okay. Here's a few more for you to try. I'll put up some answers to these on Wattle. Draw some nice little, put some comments in the margins of each of them. Plot 4 ain't too bad. There's a trouble with doing this sort of stuff. It is a subjective judgment. You have to train this subjective judgment. This is one of the reasons we're going to look at example after example after example. So you build up a toolbox for making these subjective judgments. Okay? I would probably have looked at plot 5 and gone, not too bad. Other people might have looked at plot 5 and gone, ooh, variance seems to be decreasing, then getting bigger. Maybe it's just a feature of the fact that we've already got certain observations. We're only observing certain there might be a bit of clustering going on in the background. But most of the time, that's probably not too bad. Compared to a lot of the other things we've looked at, that's pretty good. Plot 6 is pretty bad. Plot 7 is pretty bad. Plot 8, if you look carefully, you see a cyclical thing. That's actually how autocorrelation in time series shows up, typically. In other words, we've got a relationship between this year's element of the time series and the previous element of the time series. Or seasonality, things like different seasons in a time series. Okay. Notice those two there actually help you to assess these residual plots. Help you to assess basically those two assumptions there. The one they don't tick off is normality. If you can work out how things should look, how normally distributed things should look in a residual plot, you're doing better than me. The one thing I have to do to check the normality assumption, because this is still assumption, even though I argue it's not particularly important, is that I need to do a different sort of plot to check it. And what we normally do, this is from JMP, that's a histogram, should look like a bell shape. That's a box plot, should look symmetric in both the whiskers and the box. Or here's a QQ plot, which is probably my preferred way of assessing normality. So there's pretty normally distributed residuals. Arguably a little bit of departure from normality in the upper tail there, but typically not going to be so much of an issue. It's more when you've got extremely long tails than slightly shortening tails. That's going to be a worry. And there's a diagram that's in the regression modelling brick. Typically, you see when you see things going wrong in a normal quantile plot, that's what can go wrong. You get shorter tails than you should have, longer tails. You've got an outlier. You get an asymmetric pattern. That one's too short in that tail and too long in that tail. You get rounding and clustering. You get all sorts of things going on. Now, the normal quantile plot is not the one you should be looking at for most of the assumptions. It's that residual plot versus the fitted values plot. Okay, that's a quick summary of regression modelling. I will come back and have a look at the mathematics, the mathematical descriptions of models. I'll probably do that at the beginning of next week, because I just don't think I'll get time to do it today, because I'd like to go through the workshop properly. Now, this is a 2-hour session. Do people want me to take a break in the middle or just keep going straight through? Or do you want a 5-minute break to let's go to the toilet and then come back, or what? I suspect the tape runs from 4:05 to 5 to 6. But if we have a 5-minute break now, I will only go to 10 to 6, which gives me a fighting chance of getting back to the CBE before it locks and I'm separated from my bike, so I can't go home. So, do you want a 5-minute break? Okay, you're going to have to be brave here. Stick your hand up if you want a break. Stick your hand up if you don't want a break and you want to make sure these other people sort of, look very nervous because they want to go to the toilet. I think you're outvoted. Bad luck. I'll sneak off now if you really need to. Okay, so we'll keep going for this, at least this week. Normally what I'll try and do is because I was trying to rush through everything to get the revision, give you an idea of what you should be revising, thinking about, remembering from the first course. I wanted to get that out of the way. Normally I won't be going through this quickly. Okay. So, here's the first case study. You've got some details in front of you. So, let's imagine Arthur Meyer has walked into my office back in 1953. I actually only started university in 1978, so I did contracts in this very room with Nick Seddon back in 1978. That's the last time I've been here for anything other than a seminar. In the meantime. So let's imagine Arthur Meyer has walked into my office. He's brought this wonderful little data set with him, and he's talking me through the issues, what he wants to do with it. The trouble is we don't have Arthur Meyer handy, so we're going to have to do the top of the second page by thinking through what have we got, what do the researchers want to know. I think the big hint here is the book that Arthur published in is a thing called Forest Mensuration. Mensuration is just a fancy word for measurement. Why do you think foresters would want to measure? What do you think foresters want to measure? What is the real research question? If you can't get it from just at least thinking through it, I've given you some stuff from the Minitab handbook where they're trying to lead you by the nose through that same decision. So what do you think is the research question we're trying to answer here with these data? Yeah, I mean, foresters basically, they are people who manage forests, typically so they can be harvested for timber. So what do you think the real variable of interest is here? Volume, yeah. It's the one that we don't really know until we've chopped the trees down and processed them for timber. The other ones we can get a good handle on by basically before we do that destructive sampling. We can there are even tall trees there are ways to measure the height, trigonometry. Okay. There's silly ways to measure the diameter, especially of cherry trees. You basically stick a tape measure around them at chest height. And that's what the diameter measurements here are if you read the description carefully enough. Okay. So, how do you think the data were collected? Well, we've actually chopped down 31 trees. Okay, so they've been collected by observation of sorts. I don't know why we chopped down those 31 trees. Maybe we chopped down 31 taken at random throughout the forest as a way of sampling from a larger population. Or we could have just chopped down a single stand, all in the same place. Why is that important? Well, it's that question about how representative is the sample of the population. If it is just taking one tree from here, one tree from there, essentially selected at random from the entire population, then we may be able to generalise our results to the entire forest. If it's just this was the stand that was handy and we cut them all down, they may not be very generalisable at all. Okay, so this is presumably done by destructive sampling. But the obvious research question here is that if we weren't to do destructive sampling, if we'd had a nice healthy forest of black cherry trees, could we have a reliable way of estimating the volume of wood that we would get from that forest? In other words, to keep the accountant happy. This is all part of a huge tax scheme. Somebody's invested money in this, and they want to know what their likely return is. So the accountants are on our back. They want us to estimate the amount of usable timber. So that's the research question. What do I do next? I'm going to do some exploratory data analysis. So really, if you look at the things on the back of the sheet there, if you like, the research question is that the first research question, the data, is really thinking about this top bit. The next bit, examine the data, is basically the exploratory data analysis. What variables do I have? Well, I've got height and diameter, which I'm hoping can be used to predict the volume of usable wood in a tree. Are they continuous, categorical, discrete? They're numerical, continuous, aren't they? They're good old-fashioned regression modelling, the first semester sort of variables. We aren't in any new territory yet. There is one little qualm here. They're not all measured in the same units. Who's old enough to know how many inches in a foot? Who's American enough to know how many inches in a foot? 12, yes. You win today's caramel koala. Okay. Yes, there were 12 inches in a foot. I grew up before metricisation, so in both Australia and England. So that sort of stuff's second nature to me, but I knew it probably wasn't to you. Let's have a look, do some exploratory data analysis. So what I've done here is I've gone into, and I've downloaded this from Wattle, say. It's not available in Wattle just yet, but it will be. I'll put my code up once we finish this workshop. I've downloaded it to here, put it in a separate folder. If I now open that by going open with and going RStudio, it's probably the best way to do it. RStudio is probably the one I'm going to use most of the semester. Okay? Once you've set up the association on your own computer, it should look like it's an RStudio file. And so when I just double-click now, it should open. In fact, I have opened it, and it's here. I've even made the text a bit bigger so you can see it. Can everyone see that text? And I'll have to, read the keywords. Okay. So I start running some commands. In my search path in R, by default, even though I haven't created anything yet, if you look here, there is nothing in my environment because I haven't created any objects yet. Doesn't mean I'm doesn't mean I don't have any available. In fact, there's a whole heaps of things in my search path. There's the RStudio tools, because I loaded RStudio, not just basic R. There's a stats package with all the basic R stats commands. There's a graphics package, a utilities package. There's a datasets package. What's at that datasets package? Hello, there's a thing called trees. If I type trees, there should be some very familiar looking data there. So it's actually the same data. This is a classic data set. Been used for teaching stats for longer than I've been learning stats. Okay, the only difference is somebody's renamed one of the variables from diameter to girth. I'd like to accuse the Americans of this sort of vandalism, but it may not have been. It might have been an Englishman in that case. If you go to help trees, you get a help file for anything that's a part of basic R and for most of R packages, and you notice that it tells you a little bit more about the data, though everything that's there is also in your description you've got there. Notice it gives different sources for it. The reason this data set's used over and over again is that's where it first came into popularity. It came out with Minitab, which was a teaching package used in the 1970s and 80s. I don't know how Atkinson gets a gong for this one, because I've seen the same data set published in a number of other places. The original place was Arthur Meyer, Forest Mensuration 1953. That's the only resource here I haven't been able to track down. So I'm not sure exactly what Arthur Meyer had to say about his own data set. I will tick that off eventually. Anyway, I'd prefer to have the version you've got in front of you, so I'll read it in again. So I'm going to use the read table command. I have given you the Cherry data on Wattle, downloaded it here. It's in the same directory from where I opened R, so this should work. Here are the names. And in fact, if I just go Cherry, I can see the same data, just to check. So now it's called diameter, height, and volume. But it's exactly the same numbers again, unless I've made a typing mistake, which is always possible. One of the things you have to do in statistics is double check everything. Okay. So, let's do a little bit exploratory data analysis. Here's a pairwise scatter plot. The pairs command is a nice, powerful one for doing this. It plots each of the variables against each other, pairwise, two at a time. And if you ask for the panel equals panel.smooth, you trace your way through the help files, you find that what that gives you is a Loess smoother, a locally weighted regression smoother. Okay, I'll go into those a bit later on maybe. So, if our response variable is volume, the thing we're really interested in, and our candidates for explaining that are diameter and height, what comments could I make? Well, it looks like both diameter and height could be used to predict volume, doesn't it? They've both got some sort of relationship with the response variable. The relationship between height and volume is, if anything, got increasing variance to it, though it looks like it could be roughly linear. The relationship between diameter and volume has got this slightly worrying curve to it, hasn't it? Okay. Let's also have a look at the nature of the variables. You can calculate some basic summary statistics. So there's some variable means, some variances, some correlations. And yes, there's a reasonable correlation between height and volume. A really good correlation between diameter and volume. And of course, a perfect relationship between volume and volume. But we don't go around using volume to predict its own values. Okay. We could also have a look at things like, do the means and the variances mean much? Well, probably not. One of the things we usually do is try and calculate a standardized measure where we can. So here's the coefficients of variation. They are the standard deviation, which is the square root of the variance, divided by the mean. So it's sort of saying how much is the standard deviation for this variable as a percentage of its mean. In other words, how relative is this variable compared to the size of its mean? Because these are all in different units. They're all in, we need to sort of get the units out of there. Coefficients of variations are in standard units. Okay. In other words, what we're doing in the standard deviation is of a cherry diameter is going to be in feet. The mean for cherry diameter is going to be in feet. Feet divided by feet, the units cancel. It's a standardized measure. So relative to each other, the least variable is height. This is where I'd love to get my hands on Meyer's original documents, because I suspect what it is these cherry trees were part of a plantation that was all planted at the same time, and all the trees are roughly the same height. Hence, there's not much variation in the heights. Okay? Diameter is slightly more variable, and the one that we probably most interested in, but the one we only get for these 31 trees when we sample them, is volume. So that's the most variable. So in a sense, volume here is the unknown, or the least known, and we're going to model in terms of the better known ones, height and diameter, things that we can readily measure. Okay, what's a first take on a model here?
What's the main obstacle code? Is it standard deviation divided by the...
So the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. Okay, the variance is in feet squared for diameter. It's in feet squared for height. Feet squared for diameter it's in inches squared, sorry. Feet squared and feet squared. Standard deviation is the square root of those, so it's in feet. The means, which are further up there, are all in the same units. So these are unitless measures. In other words, you can compare this across variables because they're standardized measures. Okay? And so in relative variability terms, the most variable is volume, the third one. The least variable is height, the middle one. And the middling variability one is diameter. In other words, which of these variables do we have the best handle on? The answer is height. Which do we have the worst handle on? The answer is volume. But what I'm calculating there is what's called the coefficient of variation. It's a basic statistical measure you should have learned about in first year, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. It's just a standardized measure for comparing variability across different variables by making them unitless. So, first thing I should do is I'm going to attach the data. That's going to change my search path. Now, suddenly the cherry stuff is at position 2. It means what I can do is now refer to those just by their name. I don't have to keep putting cherry $diameter everywhere. I can just go diameter. And I'm referring to the ones from the cherry stuff because it's high enough up in the search pattern it will find those before it finds anything else. I'm going to do some nicer plots. And here I usually, again, I borrow a bit of the hunting of the snark. Firstly, I draw a plot of the right dimensions. and then I'm going to put in the things I want to put in on the plot. But I always like this first plot because in the Hunting of the Snark there's a map that's not going to distract anybody because it's perfectly blank. And the owner, the bellman, the owner of the boat, is very proud of that map because it just won't mislead anybody. So here's at least a graph that's not misleading. But notice what I have done is I've basically set it up so that it goes back to 0. So one of these things I'm going to try and fit an intercept. I'd like to know where it crosses the vertical axis at 0. I'd like some way to interpret the intercept. So I set up the basic stuff there, and then I add in the data observations. So here's diameter against volume, and yes, you can see the distinct curvature that's going on there. Okay. Obviously, later on, I want to do things like add the first potential model to this graph and so on, so I can assess them. But that's not the only candidate. If you like, these are just blown up versions of the earlier stuff. Now, notice height. All the trees were in sort of the 60 plus sort of range. So that, which is again, my gut feeling here is they were all planted together. And they've all reached a certain height. Some have reached a better height because they've got better watering, better growing conditions, but they've all reached at least to some height. And so the origin is a long way away here. If we were just fitting a simple linear regression model in this case, we probably wouldn't be that interested in the origin. If I force a 0 origin on things, I don't get a very good model at all. I get something that goes like that. So one of the things I always do is I always fit lower order terms in these models unless there's a good a priori reason not to. If I don't force it to have a 0 origin, I will probably get a regression model that goes like this, and the intercept for it would be somewhere that's highly negative. It would be uninterpretable in this situation. I can't believe that a 0 height tree gives me negative volumes. But it at least allows maximum flexibility in the way that the model fits the data. So you've got to remember one thing about regression models. They are local linear approximations. They only guaranteed to give you sort of reasonable results within the range of the data used to fit the model. And we do a lot of things that we will fit intercepts because in doing so we allow to fit a more flexible model. So here's a naive first linear model that involves both variables. And so I've just regressed volume on diameter and height, a multiple regression model. Simple, straight out multiple regression model. It's probably the way I probably would start modelling these sorts of things. You throw all your variables in the mix and see what's going on. And it suggests that, yes, those correlations have turned into at least reasonable relationships. And if I go down to the coefficients, I get some highly significant coefficients. Am I doing sensible analysis here? I probably shouldn't leap straight to the analysis of variance table, and certainly shouldn't leap straight to the summary table. I should go back and have a look. First of all, are the assumptions underlying this model, the assumptions I make in fitting this model, are they satisfied? How do I assess the assumptions? Residual plots. So I should have done this first. So here's the main residual plot. Houston, we have a problem. That's my attempt at an American accent. Very bad, wasn't it? Okay, so obvious curvature. That curvature in the relationship between diameter and volume has come through as pretty obvious curvature in the residuals. I probably wouldn't I probably wouldn't go any further with the residual plots because I know there's a problem here. I need to do something to fix the model. But typically, yes, R will plough on and give me the normal quantile plot. Normality is not a problem. There's no obvious real obvious departures from normality. 31's looking a little bit like an outlier, like it was on the previous plot. But, you know, there's a bit of a gap here between 31 and the rest. It's probably an influential point. I don't usually discuss that. When I teach regression modelling, I don't usually discuss this plot because I find it doesn't tell me anything that I didn't already get from the first plot. It's supposed to be a constant variance plot. And I don't really trust the median smooth that they've drawn there. Here's a useful plot quite often. It's some sort of outlier plot. And that's suggesting that 31 is an outlier in a sense. It's outside of Cook's D of 0.5. That's really arbitrary. Don't take my word for it. That's what Dennis Cook told me. He couldn't believe that people were interpreting his things in these sort of terms, you know. Just 0.5 is bad, 0.4 is good. Nap. Cook's D is at best a relative measure. A Cook's D that stands out compared to all the others, even if it's only 0.1, is probably not a good Cook's D. Similarly, a Cook's D of about 0.6 is no problem if there's other things, you know, that aren't too far away from it. So, what could I do to model this? So, we're going to try and fit and refine a model. So, the stage of the process we're now doing is we're cycling through these three. We're proposing a fit some model. What could I do to fix this?
Transform variables.
Yes. I could also, so typically I could start with a mid-range transformation like log, maybe go to something slightly weaker like a square root or something slightly stronger if it didn't work. And that's typically what we did in regression modelling. We tried some sort of empirical approach to try and model this. Before I go down that line, I might have a conversation with Arthur. Because he's a scientist. He's come into my office not a completely blank mind. He's been thinking through the problems as well. Typically, even in forestry, they'll have a whole history of models they fit in these sort of situations. So I might go back to the science and think, what's a sensible way to model this thing in this situation? You know, I talk to the client. How would you normally go about this sort of situation? Okay, and typically what they do, I'll let you in on this. Okay, so let's think about a model for trees. Here's a tree. So this is going to be pretty ordinary if we do this and work better than this. Okay, so here's a tree. I've made a few assumptions here in drawing this tree. I've already made a couple of assumptions about where's the usable timber. Probably most of it's in the trunk. Typically, if I harvest the tree, I may harvest the whole lot, but I might be using the bark and the branches for wood chips. And I sell them after to Japan where they make paper out of them. But if I'm actually after planking timber, then typically I'm getting my planks from this, the trunk of the tree. What's that look like? two basic geometric shapes you could possibly propose here. So, first of all, here's your diameter. And here's your height. So I'm presuming the height's measured to the top of the usable timber. Diameter's measured, remember, about chest height. So it may not be the diameter I was looking for some of these models. But here's one I could do. I could do a cylinder. Here's a different one. Who remembers enough of high school mathematics to tell me what the volumes of these things are? So nobody wins that caramel koala. Had to do that one myself. Okay. So, what's R here? So V is volume. R equals, well, half of the diameter. And H equals the height. So a sensible thing to do would probably be try some sort of squared term in my model. A squared term in at least diameter, wouldn't it? Or a squared term in radius. But first of all, let's convert radius into feet, the same as everything else. So I'll divide my diameters by 12 to get down to feet rather than inches. And then I'll divide by another 2 to get to the radiuses. So I should divide my diameters by 24 to get to my radiuses. Make sense? Good. Okay. So, if I divide diameter by 24, square it and multiply by height, I'm calculating the volume of a cylinder, and I'm comparing that cylinder volumes with the timber volumes. Does that look like a plausible thing for a nice straight linear model? Looks pretty good, doesn't it? So I can either make that calculation and derive this new variable, which if you like is mathematical volume, and then use mathematical volume to predict observed volume. So just a simple integration between those two might be one way to go. In terms of the original variables though, well, let's actually think about just introducing a squared term instead first. So there's how I get to radius in feet from diameter, and then radius in feet squared, I square those to get a squared term. Let's add that squared term into just an ordinary linear model. So here's my second attempt at the model. So cherry.lm2, and everything's looking nice and significant, isn't it? And again, go to the summary table. You know, everything was pretty significant there except the thing I'm probably not too interested in, which is the intercept. How do the plots look now? Is that a better plot? Yes. Okay. Maybe almost good enough. There's possibly a little bit of a hint of increasing variance. Here's the normality plot. No real problems there. Here's the plot I ignore, so I'll ignore it again. And here's the outlier plot. So 31 is no longer an outlier. It seems to, well, it could still be an influential point. But it's got a pretty reasonable value of Cook's D now. It's almost a, it's a pretty low value of Cook's D because it doesn't appear out in the corners. Notice I could have just got a Cook's D plot by going which equals 4. So when I said there were 6 plots, there are actually 6 plots you can get with the standard plot function. 2 of them are hidden. Here's just a bar chart of Cook's distances. And 31 doesn't rate at all. The highest is 18, which is not extreme compared to 17, which is not that extreme compared to 30, which is not that extreme compared to the next. In other words, they're all within the arbitrary 0.5. Is that the best model I could have fitted there? He says, hiding the one that's sneaking up that I'm going to fit now. What else could I do here? Yes, definitely. So, let's leave aside the point that they're going to be cylinders or cones. Here's my basic equation I'm going to use to try and model things. C is just some sort of constant. Pi r squared times height. Both cylinders and cones fit that basic pattern of a model. If I take logs of both sides, so let's put the pi here. Now, if I take the log into here, it's log of r squared. That means I can bring the 2 down here, plus ln h. Okay, remember the basic rules for manipulating logs? So it's not just regression modeling we have to revise, it's first year mathematics as well. Okay, or high school mathematics. Does that look like a linear model? Yeah. It's linear in the log variables. So, let's fit that one. So I take the log of volume, I take the log of radius in feet, and the log of height. I'm not worried about the intercept. I'll get some sort of intercept, and I'm now going to have some interpretation for that. That's going to equal c times pi, the log of c times pi. So basically have a have a look at that intercept and see what it is. Let's have a look. Everything's now high significant. That's wonderful. But what I really want to know is how are the plots going? Look pretty good. Arguably, if there was any increasing variance in that plot for LM2, I don't really have the same thing here. I'd be really hard pushed to say that's increasing variance, then decreasing variance. You've got to ignore the fact that R will by default always label the 3 most extreme points. Okay? It's misleading. Sometimes sometimes this median smoother can also be misleading. So this is why we're going to run you through example after example, so you can decide what you're going to pay attention to and what you're not. Here's the normal quantile plot, no worse than the earlier ones. Here's the changing variance plot, and I don't believe that a word of that. And here's the outlier plot, and the Cook's D limits have got so far out that they've almost disappeared off the map. Okay. Arguably, this is the best fitting of the three models we've seen so far. Okay. So, I would actually be happy enough with those plots that I consider we're now in the category of an appropriate model, one in which the assumptions are okay. How good a model it is, now that's the next question. Now we move on from the third point here to the fourth point. In terms of the diagram we've been looking at here, we're now going down to this bit here. The last box is these things here. We're going to look at the summary table in anger. Here's the summary table. I might just give myself a bit more room so I can see more of it. Here are the coefficients of this model. What should these coefficients be if I really have got a sensible conical or cylindrical model for the volume? If that mathematical model has actually got any real credence? Well, let's think about it. What should the coefficient of ln r be, of the log of r, log of the radius? Should be 2. What should be the coefficient of the log of height? Should be something close to 1. Whoa. Radius of the log of radius in feet, the coefficient of it is 1.98, pretty close to 2. The coefficient for height is not too far from 1, suggesting that really what we are doing here is implementing that conical or cylindrical model for the trunks of these trees. Okay. So what I could do is I could have a look at that second coefficient, that 1.98 for feet. I can have a look at its standard error. I could do a t-statistic for it. But notice the t-statistic I'm going to do for it here, I'm going to subtract off 2, which is the hypothesized value. I apologise to the people listening on the tape. I'm going to hypothesize it's equal to 2. So the t-statistic I'm going to calculate here is going to be the observed coefficient minus 2 divided by the standard error. So what I've done here, and then I'm going to have a look at what are the limits on that. Well, actually, let's do that bit first. And I can even calculate a p-value. So I'll quickly run you through that on the document camera, and then we might have to end for the day. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying coefficient of ln r equals 2. So a t-test for it. So I'm going t equals, so really the null hypothesis here is that beta 1 equals 2 versus the alternative that beta 1 is not equal to 2. So t is going to be the observed beta 1 minus the beta 1 under the null hypothesis, which is 2, divided by the standard error of beta 1. And the number we got for that was minus 0.23. Okay. Here's our t distribution. We're at observed minus 0.23, And the p-value for that is going to be anything bigger. The p-value is going to be those there. And that's pretty obviously going to be bigger than 0.05. In other words, we're well and truly in the situation where we'd accept the null hypothesis that beta 1 equals 2 rather than reject it. Does that make sense? Okay. And so the p-value we actually get is 0.8. We're pretty much in the middle of this distribution. And where did I get, what degrees of freedom did I use here? Well, it was the degrees, it was LM.LM3 degrees of freedom from the model. It was the degrees of freedom associated with the error in the model. 28 degrees of freedom. So it's a T with 28. So using a T with 28 to assess that. What I do in the rest of the code is I go through and I show that the coefficient of height is not different from 1. And I actually also show that the constant I get is not different from either pi or pi on 3. In other words, a cylinder or a conical model would both work here. But there's a whole other heap of other things going on here. And so what I'd like you to think about, and we'll finish off at the beginning of the next lecture, which is next Monday at 4 o'clock, is how good is this model? How can it be used to really answer the research question? Can I really use it to go around assessing what the volume is going to be in timber that hasn't been logged yet? Okay? And what are the caveats? I've made a lot of assumptions, and not all of them have been statistical here. I've made a lot of assumptions about the data. Think through all those issues and come back on Monday next week prepared to discuss them. And go home so I can get out of here and go and get my bike before I get locked out. If I miss the closing of the
That's why I'm while you're saying while you're backing up. So I'm actually a graduate student and I haven't this yet.
I can't hear. So when I'm not looking at you, I can't hear. Just allow me to finish this. Okay.